Okay. Mr. President, I rise today to oppose Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court and to ask my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats alike, to recognize exactly what's at stake here. The philosopher Nietzsche once said that if you stare long enough into the abyss will stare back into you. My friends, we're here in the U.S. Senate, we're staring into the abyss. And what is staring back at us is a future in which the American people's trust in the Supreme Court is being irreparably damaged. To vote yes on Brett Kavanaugh is to send a message to every woman in America that your voice doesn't matter. If you risk everything, your security, your stability, your reputation, to come forward and speak truth to power about a sexual assault, they will call you credible. They will call you courageous, but they will not believe you. It's a message that says, if you survived a sexual assault, don't bother telling anyone, because you must be mistaken. This traumatic and unforgettable moment in your life never happened. It must have been someone else. My friends, to confirm Judge Brett Kavanaugh with what we now know would be to forever tarnish the credibility and reputation of the highest court in our land. So here's what we know. We know that Judge Kavanaugh faces multiple credible allegations of sexual assault. And yet the investigation that was conducted looks nothing like the FBI investigation that was promised. Not by President Trump, not by the senators who called for it, or by anyone else. We know that neither Dr. Ford or Judge Kavanaugh were interviewed by law enforcement, the very essence of what's the subject of the investigation. Neither of them were interviewed. We know that dozens of people with corroborating evidence were flat out ignored by investigators. I've heard some of my colleagues call this investigation, quote unquote, thorough. How do you call an investigation thorough when neither the accused or the accuser were interviewed by the FBI? How do you an investigation thorough when 40 corroborating witnesses who volunteered information to the FBI in recent days were reportedly ignored? You can't get corroboration if you don't talk to corroborating witnesses. The answer is simple. It's not thorough, and it's not trustworthy. This entire process, including the use of executive privilege to deny the Senate access to hundreds of thousands of documents of Judge Kavanaugh, has been shrouded in secrecy. And why the secrecy? Because President Trump and his team are desperate to get Judge Kavanaugh confirmed by any means necessary. Let's remember what's going on here. The President of the United States is subject of a federal investigation into whether his campaign accepted assistance from a hostile foreign power during the 2016 election. Already the president's campaign chairman, foreign policy advisor, former national security advisor have pled guilty to federal crimes. He could have chosen any of the judges included on the right-wing list assembled by the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society. Instead, he picked the one judge with unprecedented views of presidential power. There's no other explanation for President Trump choosing Brett Kavanaugh that I can think of other than he hopes that this will be his get-out-of-jail card. The last few weeks have been a flurry of breaking news alerts and breathless gossiping in the halls. I'm thankful for Dr. Ford's courage and candor. She spoke her truth and has inspired countless others to break their silence. I believe her. I believe survivors. New Jersey is home to 1.8 million survivors. That's 1.8 million reasons to oppose Brett Kavanaugh. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, less than a quarter of sexual assault victims reported those incidents to police in 2016. And after this past week, it's all too easy to see why. Leader McConnell has called the allegations of Dr. Ford, quote, unsubstantiated smears. What an insulting statement. When will we as a society begin to believe women, to trust women It can't come soon enough. I was in the midst of my first campaign for Congress when Anita Hill's allegations of sexual assault against Judge Clarence Thomas were investigated but ultimately disregarded by the Senate. I'm proud to have been elected to the House in 1992, the so-called Year of the Woman. Across the Capitol, a record 4 women were elected to the Senate. My colleague, Senator Patty Murray, decided to run after watching what happened to Anita Hill. And she's still here, fighting for survivors, and I'm proud to have her as my colleague. We look back at the Clarence Thomas hearings as a moment that failed America and failed all survivors of sexual assault. And yet here we are in 2018, and it appears as though we've made little progress. After Dr. Ford's testimony, my Republican colleagues and even conservative pundits praised her credibility. It only took Judge Kavanaugh's outrageous performance, a performance we now know was misleading at best and untruthful at worst, for these same Republicans to cast her aside. The message they've sent to survivors who are brave enough to come forward is clear. We will listen to you, but we will not believe you, and we will not trust you. Despite having the cards stacked against her, I was shaken to the core by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's words last week. She answered every question with bravery, with candor, with humility. Meanwhile, Judge Kavanaugh was evasive, belligerent, and according to many of his acquaintances, repeatedly untruthful. What my Republican colleagues can't seem to grasp is that you can be at the top of your wealthy prep school class and still abuse women. You can be a Yale Law School graduate and still abuse women. Unfortunately, you can even be the President of the United States and still abuse women. Furthermore, Judge Kavanaugh's partisan outburst was downright disturbing for a potential Supreme Court justice. How many norms did Judge Kavanaugh shatter in that hearing room? It's one thing to be emotional. It's another to call the allegations of Dr. Ford or Deborah Ramirez and others a coordinated left-wing conspiracy, an act of political retribution for the Clintons. He said the questions posed by Democratic senators during his confirmation hearing were, quote, an embarrassment, and called the process a circus. This coming from a man who pressed Ken Starr to ask President Clinton sexually explicit questions. And we all know the circus that the Starr investigation turned out to be. But I guess the same standards don't apply to Brett Kavanaugh. If you're Brett Kavanaugh, you can lie under oath about things big and small and never face the consequences. At the end of the day, Judge Kavanaugh's hysterical political rant confirmed what many of us already knew about this man. He's a political operative cloaked in judicial robes. As Kavanaugh said himself, quote, what goes around comes around. Does this sound like the words of an impartial, independent judge? Never before in my life have I seen a nominee, let alone a Supreme Court nominee, behave as though he was entitled to this lifetime appointment. He's not. It's the American people who are entitled to justice, to a justice who tells the truth, who conducts himself in a dignified manner, a justice who doesn't face credible accusations of sexual assault. The Supreme Court deserves better than Brett Kavanaugh, and so do the American people. And more than 1,000 legal scholars and counting agree, coming out against Kavanaugh's nomination because his partisan and venomous rhetoric has no place on the Supreme Court. This process has further poisoned the confirmation process. It was Senate Republicans who orchestrated the theft of a Supreme Court seat with more than 9 months left in President Obama's term. Apparently, being nominated by President Obama is more disqualifying than being accused by multiple women of sexual assault. It's clear my colleagues will stop at nothing to tip the scales of justice against women, consumers, and patients for generations to come. And for women, the stakes couldn't be higher. President Trump promised to only nominate judges who would overturn Roe versus Wade. And yes, earlier today, a colleague of mine pointed out that the Republican National Committee platform has long included overturning Roe versus Wade. In my view, that is precisely why we cannot trust a longtime GOP political operative like Brett Kavanaugh to uphold a woman's right to choose. There's a difference between saying that precedent deserves respect and saying that it cannot be overturned. They are not both the same. I think some of the things I've heard about the aspirations of some of my colleagues about Judge Kavanaugh are unlikely to be realized. This is what is at stake here: the basic principle that women have a right to make their own private medical decisions. My daughter has grown up never knowing what it was to live in a country where women were denied reproductive rights. And now I fear my granddaughter may grow up never knowing what it was like to live in a country where women had reproductive rights. And it isn't just women's health that is at stake. The Trump administration is arguing in federal court as we speak that the ACA's protections for pre-existing conditions are unconstitutional, which makes Judge Kavanaugh's record of ruling against consumers and siding with corporate interests all the more troubling. There are 3.8 million New Jerseyans who have pre-existing conditions. Some illness during the course of their life, a heart attack, a set of diabetes, Parkinson's, maybe some birth defect that have denied them in the past insurance coverage. We eliminated that under the Affordable Care Act. No more discrimination. There are 3.8 million New Jerseyans who have pre-existing conditions. For me, that's another 3.8 million reasons to oppose Kavanaugh's confirmation. So yes, the stakes have never been higher. The threat to our democracy is real. The decisions coming down from a Supreme Court with Kavanaugh will change the course of America for decades to come. The Republican majority views the Supreme Court as an instrument to force an unpopular, anti-woman, anti-worker, anti-civil rights agenda on the American people. Meanwhile, President Trump views the court as yet another weapon to flout the rule of law. Well, it's time we take a stand for the integrity of our democratic institutions. It's time we live up to our duties set forth by Article 2 of the Constitution to provide advice and consent on Supreme Court nominations. In bestowing us this responsibility, the framers entrusted us with protecting the reputation and credibility of the highest court in our land. To confirm Judge Kavanaugh in the face of these allegations, in the face of the secrecy of the documents that we could not obtain, in the face of the positions he took that are clearly, in the minds of many of us, untruthful before the committee, risks forever tarnishing one of the crown jewels of our democracy. My friends, we're standing on the edge of a cliff. Should we blindly go over that edge? We risk doing irreparable damage to the reputation and credibility of the Supreme Court. I implore my colleagues in the majority to pull us back in the direction of truth and decency. This isn't about right or left. This is about right and wrong. A vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh is a vote against survivors of sexual violence. A vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh is a vote to overturn Roe versus Wade and end safe and legal abortion in this country. A vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh is a vote to overturn protections for pre-existing conditions. A vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh is a vote to roll back civil rights and voting rights. It's to take us back to a time and place none of us, I believe, want to go to. And it's a vote the American people will not forget. Not today, not tomorrow, not this November, not ever. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and observe the absence of a quorum.